Hi everyone, welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 17th. So I'm sorry that I missed class last week, and as you know, Monday was Patriots Day. So it's been a while since we've talked about Richard II, so I wanted to put some closure onto Richard II, get us ready for our next play, Macbeth. Not only does that move us into the tragedy section, but that also moves us to Shakespeare's shortest play, which is actually pretty good news in terms of where we are in the semester. In terms of paper number one, most of you should have received that paper back. Certainly, if you submitted it in by the deadline that I had indicated on the syllabus, you would have received it back. And as you all know, you all have the option of doing a revision. Once you take my comments into account, you can rewrite that paper. And I just ask that you submit in your revision along with the original graded paper with my commentary, so I can compare and contrast the two. And then you would get the higher of the two grades. And you have up until the ending of the semester to do that, but obviously the sooner the better. And my hope is that the second paper will be a much easier exercise for you, because I see the first paper as a learning exercise, so that basically you're just duplicating what you did in the first paper with your second paper. So do read my comments very carefully. That said, I know you may not necessarily be able to decipher my handwriting, so if that's the case, please let me know and I'll be happy to go through it with you. But the idea is that if you were to read my comments, you can incorporate those ideas into paper number two, which is similar to paper number one. The difference is that you would be writing about either Richard II or Macbeth or Othello. And of course, you know that I've provided you with a quotation to respond to about the complexity within Shakespeare's work, a quotation that appears actually at the ending of our syllabus. But you are also free to create your own essay topic, just as long as you get the topic approved by me. So at this point, I'm hopeful that you have finished Richard II and that you are on your way to reading Macbeth. And of course, we'll talk about production when it comes to Macbeth, but first, I draw your attention to the notes below with some quotation from Richard II, perhaps one of Shakespeare's most lyrical plays, known for these great, long, eloquent speeches. And that's also one of the critiques of Richard, is that he talks rather than acts. He really has the heart of a poet, not a warrior, and that's or a politician, and that's very problematic considering that he's the ruler. But in Act 1, Scene 1, line 178, we hear about the importance of reputation. Now, reputation is a theme that we've seen previously. Think about the importance of reputation in Much Ado About Nothing. In fact, several of you decided to write about that in terms of Benedict and Beatrice trying to maintain their reputations of not needing love and being independent people, and of course, finding out that was the exact opposite. So Mowbray talks about the importance of reputation as well. It's a major theme that we see in Shakespeare in Act 1, Scene 1, line 178. And one of the things that we find out as we continue to read this play is just how skilled Shakespeare is as a poet. And Mowbray talks a little bit about, my dear Lord, the purest treasure mortal times afford is spotless reputation. That away men are but gilded loam or painted clay, a jewel in a 10 times barred up chest is a bold spirit in a loyal breast. Mine honor is my life, both grow in one. Take honor from me, my life is done. Then, dear my liege, mine honor will let me try, and that I live, and for that will I die. And we talk about in Richard II how literally families are torn apart in terms of their allegiances and alliances, whether they should support Richard II, who is the God anointed, and one should support the God anointed without question. The problem is that the God anointed happens to be corrupt. So the question is, can one support someone who seems to be much more honorable and seems to be is paramount, because we're never completely sure about Mowbray, Richard, or Bolingbroke. We get glimpses of the way they present themselves in public, but we really don't know what's going on behind the scenes, which is very true of a political world. And Gaunt, who happens to be a wonderful symbol for what's happening to England, that England has become gaunt and is basically being cannibalized by Richard and his flatterers. And one of the things of the history plays, one of the purposes of the history plays was to allow audiences to celebrate patriotism of England's past glories. And of course, this play talks about how England's past glories are now in the shadow of the machinations of Richard. But Gaunt talks about how he's torn at that point between being either a judge or a father. And this is in Act 1, Scene 3, line 236. That, of course, as a judge, he would rule one way in the dispute against Mowbray and Bolingbroke, but as a father, he would rule another way in the dispute between Mowbray and Bolingbroke. Gaunt has a deathbed speech, again, very well known for its poetry and its lyricism. Act 2, Scene 1, line 31. And if you're ever going to tell the truth, as I say, it's probably on your deathbed. And this is where he warns Richard about the excesses of Richard's rule. Unfortunately, Richard never pays attention, and in fact does the exact opposite of what Gaunt warns him against doing. And Gaunt says, in Act 2, Scene 1, line 31. Methinks I am a prophet new inspired, and thus expiring do foretell of him. His rash, fierce blaze of riot cannot last, for violent fires soon burn out themselves. Small showers last long, but sudden storms are short. He tires betimes that spur too fast betimes. With eager feeding, food doth choke the feeder. Light vanity, insatiate cormorant, consuming means soon preys upon itself. This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war. This happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone, set in the silver sea, which serves in it the office of a will, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous by their birth, renowned for their deeds as far from home, for Christian service and true chivalry. There's a lot to unpack here. There's lots of references of disease and decay, which is what's happened. The idea of cannibalism, which is what Richard is doing, basically with his own country. Lots of food imagery, but this is in the negative as opposed to the positive, what we saw with feasting and celebration and the comedies, the idea of an insatiable appetite. There also is the praise for the former glory of England, and the reality that England's reputation, dear for her reputation through the world, now is leased out, I die pronouncing it. And of course, that goes back to the theme we had talked about earlier. Lots of references to disease. Act 2, Scene 1, line 93 is just one of the many references. And again, this is Gaunt who's talking. Now, he that made me knows I see thee ill, ill in myself to see, and in thee seeing ill, thy deathbed is no lesser than thy land, wherein thou liest in reputation sick, and thou, too careless patient as thou art, committest at thy anointed body to the cure of those physicians that first wounded thee. 1,000 flatterers sit within thy crown, whose compass is no bigger than thy head, and yet, encaged in so small a verge, the waste is no whit lesser than thy land. And of course, the idea that Richard is the true ill that is plaguing the land, and while Gaunt might be ill, his disease comes nothing close to Richard's. Now, York is torn. Of course, York wants to be a loyal subject to Richard, but at some point, York is no longer able to turn a blind eye to Richard's abuses. And we see that progression throughout the course of the play. In Act 2, Scene 1, line 63, York is talking about patience and the importance of patience. By the time we get to the mid part of the play, York is talking about remaining neuter or neutral. And then, of course, by the time we get to the ending of the play, York has made a deliberate decision to no longer support Richard, but to support Bolingbroke, even though this tears his own nuclear family apart, since his son is going to make the opposite decision. It almost reminds me of some of what occurred during the American Civil War, when brother was literally against brother. And York laments, how long shall I be patient? The idea is that he's trying to be patient, but shall tender duty make me suffer wrong? Not Gloucester's death, nor Hereford's banishment, nor Gaunt's rebukes, nor England's private wrongs, nor the prevention of poor Bolingbroke about his marriage, nor my own disgrace, hath ever made me sour my patient cheek, or bend one wrinkle on my sovereign's face. And, of course, as we go on, we see in Act 3, in Act 3, Scene 2, line 47, Richard, as he's being confronted, his public lament, one of the problems with Richard is that he's not able to keep a political poker face. At least in front of his subjects, he should show a certain level of strength. And we see instead in Act 3, and note that that would be the top of the pyramid in the pyramid structure of a 5-act Shakespearean play, how Richard vacillates between bravery and cowardice, and does so in a public forum, just reinforcing the idea that he just doesn't have the temperament to rule. Richard is also full of self-pity and blames everybody outside of himself for the predicament in which he's in. In Act 3, Scene 2, line 47, you get one of his many, many speeches where he ultimately is lamenting in despair, the position that he's in. When he says, for instance, and this is, stand bare and naked, trembling at thyself? For when this thief, this traitor Bolingbroke, who all this while hath revelled in the night, whilst we were wandering with the Antipodes, shall see us rising in our throne, the east, he threatens, or his treasons will sit blushing in his face, not able to endure the sight of day, but self-affrighted tremble at his sin. Not all the water in the rough sea can wash the balm off from an anointed king. Again, Richard is convinced that because he's anointed, he ultimately cannot be removed. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. And every man that Bolingbroke hath pressed to lift strewed steel against our golden crown, God for his Richard hath in heavenly pay a glorious angel. Then if angels fight, weak men must fall, for heaven still guards the day. And of course, as Richard is talking, one wonders, when is Richard going to take any kind of action? And perhaps he can't. When Bolingbroke shows up with an army, it's pretty clear that Richard is outnumbered and outweaponed, so that ultimately he really doesn't have anything else to do but relent. And we see Richard's vacillation, or some of his vacillation, in Act 3, Scene 2, line 83, when he says, oh, I forgot myself. Am I not king? Awake, thou coward majesty, thou sleepest. Am I not the king named 20,000 names? Arm, my name, a puny subject strikes at thy great glory. This is after how he's basically lamenting the fact that he no longer has the support that he once did. And in Act 3, Scene 2, line 129, Richard even dares to compare himself to Jesus, saying that he's been betrayed, much like Jesus himself was betrayed by Judases. Again, the God-anointed would be viewed as second to God, but we definitely get the sense of Richard's self-pity, which continues on in Act 3, Scene 2, line 144, after he's basically said that there are 3 Judases, each one thrice worse than Judas. Would they make peace, terrible hell, make war upon their spotted soul for this? He's talking about the villains and vipers and damned without redemption, dogs easily won to fawn on any man. And then shortly thereafter he goes, let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Make dust our paper with rainy eyes. Let's write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executors and talk of wills, and yet not so. And then he continues on and he talks about how we'll tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed and some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed. And he just goes on and on and on. Definitely, he doesn't have the temperament of being a ruler. Eventually, York is going to join Bolingbroke in Act 3, Scene 2, line 200. And eventually, Richard will submit, and not without a little bit of kicking and screaming there. In Act 3, Scene 3, line 143, there's that wonderful scene where both Bolingbroke and Richard are basically vying over the crown. In the BBC production, we see how both of them are holding the crown. Richard is willing to give it away and then changes his mind and says, no, no, no. The famous garden scene. This is such a dark play, and so much occurs in interior scenes. The garden scene is outdoors and it's sunny. It's about growth, renewal, and very typical of Shakespeare, putting wise words and lower order characters, in this instance, gardeners, laborers, who make comparisons between raising a garden and raising a kingdom, and needing to protect a garden much like one should protect the kingdom. Act 3, Scene 4, line 29. And this scene is also, I think, important because it shows us how the queen gets her information, how basically shut out she is from the political situation. We're going to get a very different sort of queen and a very different sort of political dynamic once we get to Macbeth, and where Macbeth will call Lady Macbeth his dearest partner in greatness. So it's nothing like what we see with Richard II. And I think you can see, if you've read any of Macbeth, that there's a change in tone, and not just because it's a tragedy. By this point in Shakespeare's career, Queen Elizabeth has died and a new king has taken over, and this is King James of Scotland. And if you'll remember, we were talking about how Shakespeare had to be careful with making political commentary during the time. It could be something that would be considered treasonable and could even result in execution. And definitely there were political questions about who would succeed Elizabeth because there wasn't a direct heir. So the play Richard II very much touched on that question of who has the, let's say, right to rule. Is it the one with the closest birthright? And again, it was muddied with Elizabeth because she didn't have any children. Or was it somebody who had the temperament to rule? And we can't even be sure in Richard II by the ending of the play that Bolingbroke does have the temperament to rule, because he becomes very Richard-like as the play progresses. And we even see that in the BBC production with some of the costume changes that go on. So either Bolingbroke is a very master manipulator, realizing that if he plays the chess pieces correctly, he might be able to put himself in a position to overtake Richard, or he truly is concerned about the welfare of the kingdom and wants to expose corruption, but once he has the opportunity to take over the kingship, he seizes it, and of course, the great Machiavellian question, does absolute power corrupt? Absolutely. Does Bolingbroke change, assuming that he ever did change, because of the position of rule? And the garden scene gives us a sense of how the entire populace is talking about the corruption that's going on within the kingdom. And of course, we know in Act 4, Scene 1, line 162, Richard is humiliated. He loses his crown. Bolingbroke intervenes, whether it's to protect Richard because Bolingbroke is a good man, or whether it's because Bolingbroke doesn't want Richard to turn into a martyr because he realizes that factions will be forming, if they haven't already formed, over who has the ability to rule. But in Act 4, Scene 1, line 200 is when we get that uneasy transfer of power. And that public humiliation of Richard, where he's taken through the streets and garbage is thrown at him. One of the ways that we can have a little bit of sympathy or empathy for Richard, it's beginning with that public humiliation. I'm not saying that we do have sympathy or empathy for him, but if we're going to have any at all, it's the fact that he's publicly humiliated, though Bolingbroke tries to put a stop to it. And we see in Act 5, Scene 1, line 16, where he's consoling the queen, his wife. And again, historically, he would have had a child bride, but for dramatic purposes, Shakespeare gave us an adult so that we could see more of a mature relationship. And we see a sense of love between the two of them. And then, of course, Richard goes back to his self-pity. In Act 5, Scene 1, line 37, he talks about how ultimately they can tell sad tales about kings as they sit around the campfire. And that's how he sees himself, as basically the subject of a sad tale one day. Metadrama, and you know that Shakespeare likes to draw direct parallels to the idea that we are watching a drama. It was very evident in something like Much Ado or Midsummer Night's Dream, where we saw the play within a play, in effect, in Act 5. But in Act 5, Scene 2, line 23, we get York, who is speaking, and York is talking a little bit about, as in the theater of the eyes of men, after a well-graced actor leaves the stage, are idly bent on him that enters next, thinking his prattle to be tedious. Even so, or with much more contempt, men's eyes did scowl on gentle Richard. Of course, making direct reference to the idea that this is a play that we are watching. Now, Bolingbroke's motivations, we can never know for certain, just like we can never know Richard's motivations for certain at the beginning of the play. I had listed a long series of questions when we were first starting Richard with the question of why. And there are multiple answers to the question of why. And that also occurs with Bolingbroke pardoning Aumerle, who basically is ready to engage in a treasonous act, York's son. And according to Aumerle, Richard is the god anointed, therefore should be king. Now, does Bolingbroke pardon Aumerle because Bolingbroke is a good man and wants to show mercy? Does Bolingbroke pardon Aumerle because they're family? All of these characters are connected through bloodlines. This is how royalty is passed on from generation to generation. Does Bolingbroke see a wonderful political opportunity that by pardoning Aumerle, that ultimately Aumerle will be indebted to Bolingbroke and Bolingbroke can basically cash in on that debt at a future date? Perhaps all of the above have a certain level of truth. And of course, by this point, Bolingbroke is now Henry IV. And as I indicated, keeping the character straight can be difficult in this play because they are referenced by surname, and they are also referenced by first name, and they are referenced by title. And keeping a chart is very, very useful. And again, if we're going to feel any kind of empathy or sympathy for Richard, I'm not saying we do, perhaps it happens in Act 5, Scene 5, line 1. This is the first time we see Richard by himself. Basically, Richard is an actor. One could say that perhaps all politicians are. And he's been performing in front of his subjects and the populace. But here, when Richard is in his jail cell, Act 5, Scene 5, line 1, we hear his private lament, and perhaps he gets close to realizing his culpability when he says, "I've wasted time, and now time doth waste me," which happens to be one of my favorite lines in the play, actually one of my favorite lines in Shakespeare. Whether or not Richard comes to a realization or not gets to the question of tragic hero, which I had asked you to consider in the attendance questions, which I'm also catching up on. But I will be doing that in the next week or so and getting all caught up as to whether or not Richard could be seen as a tragic hero. Great man, perhaps, because Richard was a king. Who experiences downfall? Oh, Richard certainly does. He loses his kingship. Because of outside forces, perhaps we could see Bolingbroke as an outside force, controlling and manipulating to try to remove Richard from power. And also because of flaws in character. Oh, Richard has many flaws. He's obviously very self-centered. He's obviously full of self-pity. He obviously is indecisive and makes some poor political decisions. And then, does this character accept responsibility? That's the tough part here with the definition of tragic hero that would have been laid out in something like Oedipus the King, Greek drama from 430 BC that helped to determine the criteria for tragic hero that authors used and adapted for their own purposes afterwards. And this is a question that I will ask you again with Macbeth and also with our last tragedy, Othello, and whether or not Macbeth and Othello can be considered tragic heroes. Note how the names of the plays have changed, that we began with plays that have very general titles like A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. Now we're moving into plays that are named after characters. And while Richard II is indeed a history because it's based on Britain's past history, it in its entirety, its title is The Tragedy of Richard II, so it has many elements of tragedy within it. And I'll let you decide whether Richard's private lament and whether Richard finally taking action to try to defend himself before he is executed, basically assassinated, is enough to indicate that Richard has accepted some culpability and is taking some sort of steps to amends. It's complicated. It'll be even more complicated when we get to Macbeth. Of course, Richard's actions are too little, too late. By the time that he decides to defend himself because he realizes that he's going to be poisoned and he's going to be executed, well, that's the result. And of course, Richard is known for his jealousy. So in Act 5, Scene 5, line 84, before he defends himself or attempts to defend himself, he laments the fact that Bolingbroke was riding his horse at one point, and even the horse now is a servant of Bolingbroke's. So proud that Bolingbroke was on his back, that jade hath he bred from my royal hand. This hand hath made him proud with clapping him. Would he not stumble? Would he not fall down? Since pride must have a fall and break the neck of that proud man that did usurp his back. O forgiveness, horse, why do I rail on thee, since thou, created to be awed by a man, was born to bear? So at this point, Richard feels he's been betrayed, even by his own horse. And of course, at the ending of the play, Bolingbroke understands that he has a very sensitive position as ruler. He could easily be usurped. Now that Richard has been killed, this doesn't solve Bolingbroke's problems. In fact, it might even make them worse, because Richard could indeed turn into a martyr. And the fact that Bolingbroke is saying, well, I never wanted Richard to be killed, is probably not good enough to convince much of the populace, or even us as viewers and readers. The idea that Bolingbroke was speaking out loud about how nice it would be if Richard didn't exist, and that ultimately one of Bolingbroke's subjects decides to act on that and kill Richard, one can't help but think that Bolingbroke was quite aware, when he was lamenting the fact that Richard still exists, that Exton would, or anyone, would decide to take action, thinking that they would be honored for their efforts, not necessarily punished. Bolingbroke's attempt, as now Henry IV, for a pilgrimage is to try to make amends. And they're great quotes throughout the course of the play. As I said, I've fallen a little bit behind with the attendance question responses, but I know I asked you to identify quotes, and I'll be reading those shortly and responding to you. That should give you a good idea of some of the major elements of Richard II in terms of the language. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peer responses, and my responses will be coming soon. If you read those as well, that'll give you a good overview of the play. And now we move to Macbeth. And this is a tragedy. And tragedies are based on the tragic tradition of the tragic hero, a great man above and beyond the ordinary, who experiences a fall, in part because of outside forces, but in part because of their own flaws in character. And then, in theory, the tragic hero should accept some responsibility. And then ultimately, we as audience learn a lesson about what we should not duplicate in terms of the errors made by the tragic hero. Macbeth is an interesting play in terms of dramatic folklore. So, if you know anything about the theater, it oftentimes is a play that comes with a lot of baggage and a lot of superstition. It's known as the cursed play. So, in theater lore, you're not supposed to say the name Macbeth because that brings about bad luck. You call it the M play or the cursed play. And it is Shakespeare's shortest play, as I had indicated before. And I also indicated that there's a new ruler in power, King James. And King James, while he tolerated the theater, maybe even liked the theater, he didn't love the theater the way Queen Elizabeth did. So, one of the things that Shakespeare, as a business person, needed to do was to write plays that would appeal to King James. One of James's criticisms of plays is that they were too long. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Shakespeare writes his shortest play when King James is in power. King James is also very interested in the supernatural. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Macbeth features three witches and issues of the supernatural. And that Macbeth, or the Scottish play, because of course King James comes from Scotland. So I think all of these things are very deliberate from Shakespeare's part in order to appeal to the new rulership. Expect dark, dark atmosphere in our tragedies. And oftentimes, strong and evil women, at least in terms of Macbeth, we're going to get a very strong woman, albeit a very evil woman. Now, there are lots of, and I've actually joked that perhaps we should name this play the Macbeths because they are equal partners in greatness. But it's named Macbeth, and in terms of production, I've been trying to show you different kinds of productions so that you could get a sense of different adaptations. So we began by watching an adaptation from Shakespeare's Globe Theatre with A Midsummer Night's Dream. Then we moved forward with the Hollywood adaptation with Kenneth Branagh with Much Ado About Nothing. Then we moved to the BBC, which tried to give a word-for-word performance of Shakespearean plays. And you may have heard of the Royal Shakespeare Company, a very esteemed theater troupe in terms of their productions of Shakespearean dramas. And I wanted to have us view a performance from the Royal Shakespeare Company of Macbeth. A bit dated 1978, but it's wonderful in terms of the way that it's able to capture dark atmosphere. It's quite eerie and quite disturbing. It stars Ian McKellen, and if you know anything about Ian McKellen, he's one of the great actors of our time and certainly one of the great Shakespearean actors of our time. In fact, when we talk about Macbeth in future classes, I'll have you watch a brief interview where he talks a little bit about his thought process where he's playing Macbeth. So, because I missed the last class, I'm going to try to make up a little bit with time by asking you to not only watch this class video right now of me putting closure to Richard II, but also watch the first hour or so of Macbeth, the first part of Macbeth from the Royal Shakespeare Company. So I would say from minute or 2 minute 58.15, and then you can finish this up the next class. Though some of you, when you start Macbeth, you might want to finish it, not only because it's Shakespeare's shortest play, but this performance really is, I believe, quite captivating. So, our attendance question for our class discussion forum on the 19th is going to be about Macbeth, and specifically about the witches, whom we're introduced to at the very beginning of the play. And do you think the witches could be considered an outside force influencing Macbeth's subsequent actions? And why or why not? Again, remembering the definition of a tragic hero, a great man. So first the question, is Macbeth great? Who experiences a downfall. The next question is, does Macbeth experience a downfall? Because of outside forces. And could we perhaps view the witches as an outside force? and also flaws within their own character. And then, of course, we continue on with the definition of tragic hero, that that person accepts responsibility for their part in their descent, and we feel pity for that character because it wasn't completely their fault. There were outside forces at play. And we also feel fear because if that could occur to that character who's above and beyond the ordinary, above us, then it could certainly occur to us and our fall would be much greater. And then there is an instructional element at the ending of the play that we shouldn't duplicate their actions. So I'm aware that you may be beginning your reading of Macbeth and beginning your watching of Macbeth. As you know, watching a performance is never a substitute for reading, it's merely a supplement for reading. But since we're introduced to the witches, the very first thing in Macbeth, I think you should be able to begin to contemplate, and there is no right or wrong answer to this. Both positions have a certain level of validity. I'm more interested in your reasoning. Do you think the witches are an outside force that influences Macbeth in his subsequent actions? Why or why not? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with Macbeth. Take care. Bye bye.